It was a February evening in the suburbs of Sydney. The sun had long since set, and the streets of Padstow were as quiet as any other peaceful Australian neighborhood. Yet, inside a small house, a situation was about to explode. Just weeks earlier, two people had stood before family and friends, exchanging promises for a future together. Now, one of them was about to lose the chance to keep that vow. David Walsh, an Irishman who had left his homeland to build a new life in Australia, returned to the house he called home. But that night, another man was there, alongside his fiancée, Katharina Cahill. Hours later, David had sustained fatal injuries. Cahill was handcuffed, and initially, she was charged with intentional murder. However, as the case unfolded, a far more complex picture emerged. A relationship that had fractured long before that fateful night, marked by violence on both sides, protection orders, and a wedding that seemed destined to happen despite all the warning signs. This is not the story of a cold-blooded killer plotting to take a life. It is the story of how a toxic relationship can quietly escalate until it reaches a point of no return. But this was not the first time violence had surfaced in their relationship. If warning signs had appeared much earlier, could this tragedy have been prevented? What are your thoughts on this? Please share them in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring real-life cases and the stories behind them. Before his name made headlines, David Walsh was a 29-year-old man who had grown up in County Wexford, Ireland. Like many young Irish people of his generation, he left home in search of opportunities abroad. And Australia, with its warm climate and open job market, became his destination. In Sydney, David built a new life. He had a job, friends, and the kind of stable lifestyle many immigrants dream of. Then he met Katharina Cahill, a fellow Irish expatriate who was also trying to carve out a life for herself in this foreign land. The bond shared by these two people far from home quickly blossomed into a relationship. To those around them, they seemed like a couple destined for happiness. Two Irish souls who had found each other in the vastness of Australia and were building a life together. In late 2016, David and Katharina decided to take the next step. On New Year's Eve, they became officially engaged. For David's family back in Ireland, his parents and his 3 children. This was joyful news, a sign that their son and father was living a happy life far away. None of them knew that, less than 2 months after that promise of marriage, David would not live to see the wedding day. Katharina Ann Cahill, affectionately known to friends as Tina, was also an Irish expatriate. She and David had been together for about 2 years prior to the night of the incident. They shared a home in Padstow, a quiet suburb in southwest Sydney. From the outside, they appeared to be a couple on the verge of marriage. Happy photos, gatherings with friends, and an engagement celebrated on New Year's Eve. But behind the doors of their home lay a completely different story. As later revealed, the relationship between David and Katharina was far from the smooth affair it appeared to be on the surface. Conflicts arose frequently. Moreover, the violence was not one-sided. Records indicate that both parties engaged in violent behavior toward one another. David exhibited controlling tendencies, while Cahill, for her part, also resorted to violence, including an incident involving a knife that resulted in injury to David. Their relationship was so volatile that each had obtained a protective order against the other, a clear indication that legal intervention had been necessary at least once before matters reached a point of no return. The paradox lies in the fact that, despite all this, they decided to proceed with marriage. They chose to get engaged and continue living together, as if their bond were strong enough to overcome the fractures that had developed. Remarkably, just weeks earlier, they had been busy preparing for their wedding. Looking back at the entire story, there were signs that, had they been taken more seriously, might have changed the outcome. The first sign was the violence itself. It was not an isolated incident, but a recurring pattern in the relationship, where arguments tended to escalate beyond mere words. The second sign was control. Evidence later presented in court revealed David's controlling nature within the relationship. Their arguments tended to intensify over time rather than subside. The third sign was the reciprocal nature of the violence. This was not a simple story of a perpetual victim and a perpetual perpetrator. Both David and Katharina had committed acts of violence against one another, turning the relationship into a cycle that both parties helped sustain. The fourth sign was legal intervention. The fact that they had obtained protection orders against each other was a clear signal that this was no longer a private matter between two people. It had become a serious enough issue to warrant the attention of the legal system. And the final sign, perhaps the most paradoxical, was that despite all of the above, they decided to proceed toward marriage. Their engagement took place as if the prior fractures had never existed. Yet, they chose to get engaged. Taken together, these signs should have served as a powerful warning. However, they were not enough to stop the couple from staying together. Nor were they enough to prevent the events that would unfold just weeks later. February 17th, 2017, began like any other weekend. Katharina and David were together, and the drinks began to flow. Their conversation in the Bondi Junction area gradually escalated into an argument. The specific cause remains unclear, but it was just one of countless tense moments that had occurred between the two. This time, Katharina chose to leave. She departed Bondi Junction with two female friends, leaving David behind. David did not follow them. Instead, he remained in the Randwick area and continued drinking. As time passed, he became increasingly agitated. He began sending messages to Katharina and her friends, either to stay in touch or, perhaps, to express the growing insecurity he felt. Meanwhile, Katharina and her friends headed to the Padstow Park Hotel. It was there that they met a man named Matthew Hyde. There was nothing unusual about this. It was merely a chance encounter at a pub, like thousands of others that take place across Sydney every weekend. However, that night, Hyde was invited back to the house in Padstow. At the same time, none of them knew that David had already returned to that house on his own. That night, David was unaware that another man would be returning to the house with his fiancée. To understand what happened, it is necessary to reconstruct the entire sequence of events from that night, step by step. Around 4 p.m., Katharina and two friends began a gathering that involved drinking. Shortly after, David arrived, and another argument broke out between him and Katharina, continuing the tension that had been simmering earlier in the day. By around 7 p.m., Katharina decided to leave the house and drove off on her own. David did not go with her. Close to 9 p.m., Katharina and her two friends arrived at the Padstow Park Hotel. There, they met Matthew Hyde, who subsequently returned to the Padstow house with the group. Meanwhile, shortly before midnight, specifically around 11:40 p.m., David returned to the house. However, he did not have his keys with him. To get inside, he was forced to break down the door. After that, David continued sending out photos and messages, likely a sign that his emotional state remained highly unstable. Then, Katharina's group, along with Matthew Hyde, returned to the house. The moment David saw Hyde walk in, everything began to unravel. A direct confrontation erupted between the two men. A scuffle ensued. Amidst the chaos, David also directed his actions toward Katharina. In that moment of extreme tension, Katharina grabbed a knife from the kitchen. Within seconds, David sustained a fatal wound. Just minutes after the confrontation began, David was beyond saving. This was not a premeditated act, nor a carefully calculated plot. It was an explosive moment, unfolding over a few brief seconds in a house where alcohol, jealousy, years of accumulated emotional pain, and a sudden confrontation all converged. What happened immediately afterward is perhaps the most crucial detail for understanding the true nature of the incident. Cahill did not flee. She made no attempt to stage the scene, cover her tracks, or vanish from the house. Instead, upon realizing the gravity of what had just occurred, she fell into a state of panic. She stayed by David's side. When emergency responders arrived, Cahill was still there, and by all accounts, she pleaded with the medical team to save his life. On February 18, 2017, the police arrested Katharina Cahill. The initial charge brought against her was the most serious under criminal law: intentional murder. Yet, Cahill's reaction immediately following the incident raised an unavoidable question. If this was a premeditated killing, why was her immediate response one of panic and a desperate plea for help? This is a question that anyone following the case would inevitably ask themselves, and it is the very question the subsequent investigation sought to answer. The investigators' task went beyond simply identifying who held the knife. What they truly needed to do was reconstruct the entire sequence of events leading up to that moment. Every statement, every text message, and every timeline marker. The scene at the Padstow home was meticulously examined. Separate statements were taken from everyone present that night. Matthew Hyde and the two female friends accompanying Cahill. Phone data proved to be a crucial piece of the puzzle. The messages David sent that night, the calls exchanged, and, most notably, the photos he sent to others just before returning home all helped investigators piece together his state of mind during his final hours. The movements of each individual were also carefully cross-referenced. The events at Bondi Junction earlier in the evening, the gathering at the Padstow Park Hotel, and finally, the group's return to the house, where David was already waiting. Cahill's own account was meticulously compared against the gathered evidence to determine whether her story aligned with the data and witness testimonies. Yet, statements were only part of the story. As the investigation delved deeper into the case file, the central question became increasingly clear. Did Katharina Cahill intend to take David Walsh's life, or was she simply reacting in a moment of total loss of control amidst fear and chaos? 4 key categories of evidence shaped the perception of the case. The first category was the history of violence between the two. Incidents occurring prior to the night of February 17th, previously issued protection orders, and a past incident involving a knife. This context was inseparable from any assessment of the events that followed. The second category consists of phone data. Messages David sent, late-night calls, and photos he shared with friends shortly before returning home. This data helps illustrate his increasingly unstable emotional state during his final hours. The third category comprises testimony from those present at the scene. Matthew Hyde and 2 of Cahill's friends. They directly witnessed the moment the confrontation erupted, and their accounts play a crucial role in reconstructing the sequence of events. The fourth category. and perhaps the most significant for the direction of the case, involves evidence regarding Cahill's mental state. Expert reports indicate she was suffering from severe depression, a condition that may have stemmed from her experiences during her long and tumultuous relationship with David. The messages exchanged that night helped investigators piece together the final moments. All these elements led to a deeper legal question. Is there a distinction between an action that results in death and one stemming from a genuine plan to kill? This is the question the court must answer. Initially, Katharina Cahill faced the most serious charge under Australian criminal law: intentional murder. The trial for this charge was scheduled to begin in 2018. However, during trial preparations, evidence regarding Cahill's mental state came to light. Based on expert assessments, the prosecution ultimately accepted a partial defense argument grounded in the principle of substantial impairment due to mental disorder, a legal concept allowing for a reduction in the severity of the charge in specific circumstances. Consequently, the charge against Cahill was altered. Instead of intentional murder, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter. This fundamentally changed the legal nature of the case. This was the decisive turning point of the entire case. It did not absolve Cahill of responsibility for her actions. Rather, it reflected a more complex reality. David Walsh's death did not stem from a calculated plot, but from a combination of factors. Violence accumulated over time, a deteriorating mental state, and a moment of total loss of control. When the case proceeded to trial on the charge of manslaughter, the court had to consider the full picture of the relationship between Cahill and Walsh, looking not only at that fateful night, but also at the long period leading up to it. The court examined the history of violence on both sides, not to assign blame to the victim, but to better understand the context that led to the tragedy. It also considered Cahill's mental state at the time of the incident, alongside the full sequence of events on the night of February 17th. A crucial point was noted. The court could not determine with certainty that Cahill had intended to take David's life from the outset. Throughout the legal proceedings, Cahill was noted for expressing deep remorse, and assessments indicated a good prospect for rehabilitation. On December 12, 2018, the sentence was handed down: 8 years in prison, with a minimum term of 5 years before parole eligibility. Upon completion of her sentence, Cahill is expected to be deported to Ireland. Yet, the sentence could not bring David Walsh back to his family. From a legal standpoint, the case's conclusion is clear. Katharina Cahill was the only person convicted in direct connection with David Walsh's death. No sentence, however long or short, could undo what happened that night. When the legal proceedings concluded, the story did not end there. For behind every case lie real people and real lives forever altered. Back in Ireland, David's family, his parents, and, above all, his 3 children, must go on living with his permanent absence. Friends in the community where he grew up, who once knew him as a young man leaving home in search of a better future, are now left only with memories and questions about what might have been. David Walsh left Ireland hoping to build a new life in a foreign land. He found love, an engagement, and a future that seemed to stretch wide before him. Yet that future lasted a mere few weeks before coming to a permanent end on a February night in Padstow. This story should not be defined solely by the sentence handed down to Katharina Cahill. At its heart remains an immutable fact: David Walsh lost his life. And behind the figure of an 8-year prison term stands a family that remains, forced to learn how to live on with a void that nothing can fill. Some relationships do not end with an amicable parting, nor with farewell letters or final, understanding conversations. Sometimes, simmering conflicts and accumulated hurts build up over the years, mounting until they reach a moment that no one, neither those involved nor outside observers, can halt or reverse. In the story of David Walsh and Katharina Cahill, what began with a relationship, a promise of marriage, and an engagement ring ultimately concluded with an irreversible death and a manslaughter conviction forever linked to both their names.